Star Wars Visions Volume 3 was released very recently, and the response has been fairly mild. Visions is one of the most exciting new Star Wars ventures for me, since it allows independent creators to chart new stories in this world that has become so beloved. While Seasons 1 and 2 were released to a mostly positive reception, it seems like Season 3 didn't quite reach the same heights. It's been often criticized for playing it too safe and not pushing enough boundaries. At least that's what people say about most of the show, because Episode 9 of Star Wars Visions is an exception to pretty much every rule this series set for itself. The final episode of Star Wars Visions Volume 3, titled Only as Black, is a psychedelic journey told through the perspective of a stormtrooper on the verge of death. It was helmed by Shinya Ohira, one of the most unique animators of the last few decades. He was the animation director for Ping Pong the Animation and was a key animator for pretty much all of your favorite anime movies. Akira, The Boy and the Heron, and The Night is Short Walk on Girl are some notable mentions. Black has been celebrated the internet over for being the most unique and breathtaking of this new batch of short films, but I still haven't seen anyone pin down a specific meaning to the short. Everyone has been clamoring to praise the film for daring to say something, but it doesn't seem like the internet really knows what it's actually trying to say beyond the obvious details. While I do think art like this deserves recognition for its uniqueness, I think these pieces of media live or die on the merits of what their meaning actually is, which is why I'm throwing my hat into the ring to try and analyze the meaning of Black. And by the end, I'm gonna try to evaluate the short film objectively and see if it actually holds up under scrutiny. So to start out with, let's talk about the aspects of this film that everyone can agree on. The short film follows a stormtrooper who has been heavily injured and is on the verge of death. In this limbo, he finds himself split into two, with one of his halves being represented by the color green and the other by red. These two halves of himself are seen fighting in spectral battles across the galaxy. It becomes very clear throughout the short film that the focus is meant to reside with the Stormtroopers, Star Wars' most classic and tested bad guy. The main character, of course, is the Stormtrooper himself, and the short film constantly shows us scenes of white-clad cannon fodder dying en masse. This also reflects the title of the film itself, Black, showing that this film seeks to focus on the darker half of the black and white dichotomy. This also follows classic Star Wars terminology, with the Empire being the ultimate power of the dark side, and the rebels fighting for the light side of the Force. So we know that this film seeks to tell the story of the so-called bad guys, the villainous stormtroopers who have been made to represent the franchise's biggest evil. And it seems that throughout the film, the goal is to humanize this faction. We see visions of our main character in what seems to be his homeworld, relaxing with a woman that has a matching tattoo to his, most likely his wife or partner, showing that even stormtroopers have families that they want to return to alive. All of what I just said is a fairly uncomplicated read of the events of the short film. Pretty much everyone on the internet has commented on things to this effect, since this aspect of the film is communicated very clearly. But there's still many details left that are a lot harder to unpack. In order to walk through this in as logical a way as possible, I'm first going to lay out the main mysteries of the short film, and then we can figure out what they mean and how that plays into the overall narrative. The biggest mystery that sticks out to me in Black is the reoccurring splitting of our main character. The two figures that are often seen fighting throughout Black are completely identical. They are injured in the same ways and are seen wearing the exact same outfits. At first, I thought one of them was supposed to be a rebel and the other a stormtrooper, but upon closer inspection, there are no notable differences between them. Well, aside from the colors that they are often painted in. One of the figures is always colored in red, seeming to mirror the most famous color of the Sith, and the other is painted in green, a color often associated with the Jedi's lightsaber. I think the most straightforward reading of this choice would be to say that the green one is meant to represent the Jedi, or the good guys, and the red is meant to represent the Sith. But that of course begs the question, why are both of these sides being represented as mirror images of the same stormtrooper? It's possible that the green is meant to embody the desire to defect and leave the Empire, while the red is the desire and responsibility to stay. But to really test that idea, we have to look at the other ways this split person is represented in the film. One really pivotal moment in the short is during the initial clash between these two figures, where the green one, which seems to be losing the fight, suddenly turns into a monster and attacks the red figure, who transforms in kind and starts fighting back. This imagery of one of the figures fighting a monster is repeated again later in the short film, where a figure with green highlights and a red haze around him is seen trying to escape the claws of a giant hand. And in the background of this, we can see the face of the stormtrooper we've been following this entire time, barely visible and darkened. Another element to consider is the imagery of one of the stormtroopers reaching out and trying to lock hands with the other. I think it's important to note in this case that the red stormtrooper is always the one to reach out first, both in the first instance where the green figure refuses to take his hand, and in the second time this appears, where the two figures finally lock hands to end the short film. I think this is one of the most key pieces of evidence in deciphering what each stormtrooper is meant to represent, since this is one of the only consistent things that sets them apart. Aside from the two central figures, there are two other characters that appear briefly in addition to the massive faceless stormtroopers. One of them appears early on in a reflection of the red and green stormtrooper fighting. They appear to have a long cape and spiky hair and are seen battling a non-fragmented version of the current stormtrooper on a snowy planet. Now this figure's face is never seen, but his outfit does remind me of a Jedi. I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of this franchise like some people may, but I doubt it would be easy to find a concrete answer as to who this is. Much later into the short film, we catch a really quick glimpse of a darker-skinned character in a robe which appears very similar to a Jedi's traditional outfit. This character is also bald and appears in a red and purple light. Since there's fairly few people of color in Star Wars as a whole, I figured this has to be Mace Windu, seeing as the outfit and general appearance are fairly close. However, notably, the eye color of this character in the short film seems closer to red than Mace Windu's brown. Alright, we're almost through with the information, so I'm just gonna fly over any other details that we missed. There's a lot of shots with eyes in the background, watching over the two split people. These are more common towards the beginning of the film, but they appear again by the end too. There's pretty consistent imagery of butterflies as well, lots of them in the scene with all of the graves, most likely of other stormtroopers. In the flashback scene, it seems to specifically be a blue morpho butterfly, but in most other shots, the butterflies are just kinda pale and butterfly-shaped. And finally, there's this quick shot of what seems to be the main stormtrooper lying in the snow with the front left part of his brain throbbing. So that was a whole lot of information, but I think laying it out like this makes it clear what the central mysteries of this short are. In my opinion, every interpretation of this film is decided by how you choose to explain the two fighting figures. I think the best way to go about it for the purposes of this video is to first go through the laundry list of images I described at the end there, and find out what thematic meaning they could have. And once we have the meaning of those on lock, we can go back to the red and green figures and their constant fight, and see what meaning we can take away from that. To start out with, eyes have a wide range of meaning depending on the context of how they are represented. They can be gateways to the soul of a lover or the symbol of a controlling surveillance state. And in this particular film, I believe the eyes are skewed towards the latter. The way they appear all around the two central figures and flash in and out of existence calls to mind imagery of paranoia or hallucination. The feeling of always having eyes on you is one that inspires sentiments of distrust and fear, particularly suspicion towards people around you. This seems like a pretty reasonable interpretation because near the end of the film, when the red figure is seen offering a hand to the green one, eyes momentarily appear and flash across the screen, signifying distrust and suspicion. Moving on to the imagery of butterflies, the ancient Greek word for butterfly was actually psyche, which is used to refer to the soul and spirit. This is fairly in line with most classic symbolism regarding butterflies, where the human soul is often represented as one. In addition to that, it is the classic symbol of rebirth and transformation, found through the transition from a caterpillar into a butterfly. The blue morpho butterfly in particular supports this interpretation, since the ancient Greek morpho is the root of the word metamorphosis, another word which means transformation. This brings us to the last piece of imagery left in the short, the singular scene of the stormtrooper lying in the snow, with the front left part of his brain glowing. According to this editorial by Patrick Boxa, it has become increasingly likely under recent studies that frontotemporal interactions can contribute to the experience of hallucinations being involuntary. Frontotemporal interactions is a fancy word that just means interactions between the front and temporal lobes of the brain. In addition to that, there have been findings that suggest that the prominence of hallucinations in some individuals can correlate with a loss of sense of boundaries of oneself. This chain of related events, from frontal lobe activity to hallucinations to a damaged sense of self, all seem to line up with what we see in the short film. While this doesn't give us too much extra information regarding the themes and message of the short film, it does confirm some very important things. Firstly is the confirmation that this is all a hallucination. Up until this point, it has been unclear as to which parts of this film are fake, and which are true-to-life interpretations of events. But from this moment, we can confidently say that every scene with the red and green stormtrooper is taking place in the mind of this one real stormtrooper. It also grounds us in where that stormtrooper actually is. From where he collapsed in the snow, it seems likely that he was a TIE fighter pilot that was shot down by the rebellion. If that theory is true, and the crash is where the pilot got all of his injuries, then that's even more evidence as to why every earlier scene is purely metaphorical. So we finally got into a place where we can start to decode what the two differently colored stormtroopers could mean. It took a long time, but we finally made it. There are a few big questions that I think need to be answered for a reading of this short film to be satisfying. The first is the biggest. What do these two figures represent? Do they have some literal or metaphorical reading that makes sense of their dichotomy? The second question regards what they actually do in the short film. Why are they constantly depicted as fighting each other? And why does the red one keep reaching out his hand to the green one? Finally, we also need to be able to rationalize what it means for these two figures to finally lock hands. We need to figure out what it could signify for them to merge into one. And all of these questions need to be answered in a way that satisfies the earlier images we discussed about paranoia, transformation, and a blurring of the self. Cutting to the chase, it's my belief that Black is trying to depict the traumatic and destructive nature of war, as well as the internal battle of this one individual who's on the losing side. In my interpretation, the Green Stormtrooper is representative of the desire to stand up and continue to fight for the Empire, while the Red Stormtrooper represents the will to survive and return home, even at the cost of giving up the battle. The entire point of the short film, in my opinion, is to explore the questions of what happens to the losing side, and even further, what decisions will someone make after they've lost the war, and where will their priorities fall? I'm sure to many of you it seems wrong to categorize the desire to live and return home as the Red Stormtrooper and the devotion to the Imperial Creed as the green one. In the general perception of Star Wars and color symbolism in general, it seems as though the side sympathetic to the Empire should be cloaked in red, while the side representative of life should be green. However, I think that's one of the many ways this short film chooses to flip convention in its visual storytelling. The biggest thing to remember when analyzing this film is that everything we see is an interpretive vision through the eyes of a stormtrooper. Stormtroopers are heavily brainwashed and indoctrinated foot soldiers that believe in the Empire's truth more than anything else. To someone in this state of mind, it would make more sense for the values of loyalty and honor to be good, and the desire to survive and abandon the Empire to be bad. I believe that's why the colors are inverted in this way. The classic color of goodness and morality, green, is used to represent what this stormtrooper considers the highest form of goodness, fighting to the death for the cause he believes in. While red, a color representing passion, love, and amorality, is used to represent his desire to desert and live on. One of the biggest reasons I settled on this interpretation of the film was because of the overall feeling of discord present in this short. Scenes flash by of war zones and stormtroopers dying en masse, yet it's accompanied by lively jazz music and energetic vocals. Triumphant scenes of X-Wings fly overhead as the broken and battered bodies of the stormtroopers lay strewn about below. Ultimately, I think this clashing of tones was the biggest hint as to the meaning of the short. What we are seeing is ultimately a victory for humanity. It's the triumph over a cruel regime by those who seek to do better. Yet we are watching this turning point in history through the eyes of the losers. The fanfare and celebration is there, but this time we're forced to see the whole picture. The Stormtroopers are historically a legion of soldiers who have absolute faith in the Empire and its goals. Through propaganda and extreme conditioning, these are soldiers trained to fight till the end for the Empire. That's why in all of these shots we never once see a Stormtrooper deserting or even thinking of betraying the Empire. They have absolute faith in their cause. But equally important is their desire to return home, to protect their loved ones and to be able to see them again. These two desires are often in conflict with one another. It's one of the many paradoxical facets of war. The reason people volunteer to fight for the Empire is because they have a family that they love that they want to protect. Yet that love drives them to volunteer for a cause that will risk their life, and make it very possible that they'll never see their family again. This is the battle that we see playing out in the mind of this one particular stormtrooper. One half of him, bathed in the green of morality, fights to get up and burn his life for the sake of the order he believes in, while the other, depicted with the red that represents love and sin, wants nothing more than to trudge home and be with the people he loves, even at the cost of the Empire. Furthermore, I think there's an additional aspect to this internal conflict, because I believe it also serves as a reflection of the battle that's going on across the universe. As I said before, I believe the classic color associations of Star Wars are being flipped at this moment, but I still believe it is significant that the two colors used are the classic colors of a Jedi and Sith's lightsabers. In that sense, while I do think the colors are supposed to be reminiscent of the classic conflict between the light and dark side of the Force, I still believe that the colors represent the inverse of what we may first assume. To start out with, the color green isn't actually used to represent the rebellion at any point in the Star Wars franchise. To us, it may make sense to associate green with the side we believe as good, but in the visual language of the series, this doesn't actually have any precedent. In fact, red is more often used as the color of the rebellion than anything else. And while deep red is often used in association with the Emperor and his closest aides, red is one of the least important colors of the Empire. In fact, in general, black and monochrome color palettes are the imperial standard of goodness. Because of all of these points, I think it's important to disregard our preconceptions of what these colors may entail when viewing this short. As is represented in the title, this story is told through the perspective of a stormtrooper, an arm of the Empire, and we need to consider what these colors may mean to him. That's why I think that the Empire is being represented by the color green, a traditional symbol of virtue and life, something that is commonly associated with goodness and morality, while the encroaching rebels are represented by the color red, reflecting their crest as well as their amorality in the eyes of the stormtrooper. I think that's why this short film stumped me so much the first time I saw it. The ways we perceive color are being used against us, as it prevents us from actually being able to see the world through the stormtrooper's eyes. Even as we, the audience, watch the short film, we are viewing it through our own inherent bias and interpretation of this universe. To make things even more complex, the two halves of the stormtrooper itself have a dual meaning. They're meant to stand in for both the conflict taking place on a galactic scale as well as the fight within this one single stormtrooper's mind. Using those interpretations, let's now go back through and try to answer those other questions I laid out earlier. I already explained what my interpretation of these figures is, so we can jump straight to the second question of what their fighting represents, and why the red one is seen reaching out his hand first. As with their identity itself, I think there's two meanings to the constant conflict between the two stormtroopers. On one hand, there's the more literal interpretation of the Empire's foot soldiers and the rebellion clashing over and over again, desperate to be the only one to survive. And on the other hand is the internal battle of the stormtrooper on the verge of death, with his desire to return home fighting with his loyalty to the Empire. The biggest thing that clued me in to the inverse interpretation of the stormtrooper's colors is because that change makes sense of why the red stormtrooper always reaches out his hand first. Under the interpretation that the red stormtrooper is the rebellion and the green one is the Empire, it's logical for the rebellion to be the one to try and cross that boundary first. In contrast to the Empire's practices of tyranny and totalitarianism, the rebellion sought to attain freedom from the Empire's oppression. The goal was never a culling of all of the Empire's soldiers, it was to establish an independent system of power outside of the Empire for oppressed worlds to flock to. And in attaining that goal, brokering a peace was never something the rebellion was opposed to. Which is why we see the red stormtrooper, representative of the rebellion, desperately trying to reach out its hand for peace. However, to the Empire, the rebellion is an entity that could never be given legitimacy, as it provided a substantial threat to the Empire's expansionism and power. This perfectly matches what we see represented in the short film. The red stormtrooper starts by trying to reach out his hand to the green one, however the green stormtrooper refuses to take it, seeing visions of duty and upholding the Empire's honor. And so the rebellion is swept away by the winds of war and has to suffer further despite wanting to come to a mutual understanding. This read also works with the two figures being stand-ins for the stormtrooper's inner psyche. The part of the stormtrooper that wants to live and return home tries to find common ground with his absolute loyalty to the Empire, by reaching out his hand and pleading to live. However, the sense of responsibility the stormtrooper feels towards the Empire is overpowering, especially when reminded of the propaganda and glory of the Empire. And so, the manifestation of his faith in the Empire refuses to take the other's hand. The last question that needs to be answered is in regards to the ending of the short film, where the two figures finally decide to join hands and accept each other, thus becoming one whole entity in the process. In the Empire and Rebellion interpretation, we can read this as the eventual ending of the war and the dissolution of the Empire's fighting forces. This is the moment many years down the line where the conflict finally comes to an end, and even those that subscribe to the Empire's dogmatic regime start to become incorporated into the new republic that is born. This makes sense as the final unity between both sides, as it addresses the question of what happens after the war is done. The scattered forces of the Empire initially refuse to take the new republic's hand, insisting on fighting till none are left standing. But eventually, many parts of the disassembled Empire lay down their arms and return home, finally finding unity under a new banner, as the ones to break the cycle of the Empire's cruelty. And in terms of the single stormtrooper interpretation, this moment represents the stormtrooper finally coming to peace with both halves of his desire, and finding acceptance within himself. Both of his sides had things that they valued more than anything else. From the side he deemed as moral, he felt an intense feeling of loyalty to the Empire and its creed, and felt the need to give his life to continue fighting for them, while his true innermost self reflected the desire to return home to the people he loved, and to accept the defeat gracefully if it would allow him to survive. These two desires were in constant conflict with each other. His green side couldn't stand his selfishness in wanting to survive and abandon the Empire, while his red side couldn't bear to lay down his life and give up on seeing his partner again. But finally, at the last moment, he was able to find resolution within himself. His duty to the Empire was able to find common ground with his desire to live, in the mutual love of his family and friends back home. And so, in the end, the stormtrooper chooses to open his eyes and live, maybe holding his duty to the Empire deep in his heart, but finally deciding to live on in the name of the love he has for his family. Both of these readings of the film also line up with the imagery presented in the short. The paranoia that is represented by the eyes and monsters are manifestations of the mutual fear between both of these parties, both on the part of the Empire and the Rebellion, and in terms of the stormtrooper's own inner psyche. This fear and villainization is ultimately what prevents the two from joining hands until the end of the film, and prevents the ultimate resolution of acceptance. Finally is the idea of transformation and the blurring of oneself. These can both be seen in the ending of the short film, where the two warring sides finally find some common ground and unity. The New Republic is able to be formed from the ruins of what was the Empire and the Resistance, and the Stormtrooper is able to find resolution in himself and move on as a new person from his near-death experience. So we did it. We finally managed to piece together an interpretation of this film that makes sense of all of its elements. There are some extra pieces of evidence that aid this interpretation, such as the lyrics to the song that plays throughout the short film, but frankly, I think that was enough boring literary analysis. What I want to discuss now is the actual quality of this film, and why everyone has been clamoring to celebrate it. And furthermore, why I feel like all of that analysis I just did may actually have been pointless. Artistically, it is inarguable that this short film is breathtaking. It is a tour de force of masterful animation and storyboarding brought to a franchise that has not experienced this level of raw artistry in a while. It's the type of thing that I would pay $10 to go to a museum and see, because it feels impactful in a way that other pieces of media aren't able to capture. But despite that, I didn't have a good time watching this short film. I personally watched through all of Vision Season 3 while taking notes and eating dinner, and despite how middling most of the season was, I was having a lot of fun just sitting back and taking it all in. But as soon as Black started, it felt like a punch in the gut. 30 seconds into the episode, I had to pause and just sit there for a bit, processing what I had just seen. And eventually I had to give up on watching it while eating and put it off for later. I had to schedule a time to come back to this short and watch it through. And every subsequent rewatch to analyze it kinda had me dreading the experience. Now obviously the experience of trying to analyze something like this is different from the casual watcher, and I'm sure a lot of people had a good time just taking in the psychedelic scenery and atonal music. And if that was all this film aimed to be, I would have no issues with it. Black could have set out to be a fun, artistic Star Wars screensaver, and it could have achieved that goal perfectly. But Black clearly tried to do more than that. There are echoes of a theme and deeper meaning in Black that are so overt it's almost impossible to ignore. From the depictions of the two battling stormtroopers to the constant imagery of butterflies and eyeballs, Black almost screams at you that it has something to say, that there's some deeper meaning to all of this metaphorical and symbolic imagery. And yet, while diving into the story, I can't help but feel that the people behind it didn't have their priorities straight. The imagery is beautiful and rich and begs to be unpacked and analyzed, but in reality I feel like the story is kept so artificially abstract. People the internet over are clamoring about this film and talking about how daring it is in its message and execution, but I think the bar for entry in actually comprehending this short film was kept so unreasonably high that people don't actually know what it's saying. It's such an interesting phenomenon to me because people are clearly able to pick up on the markers of a profound and rich story, without actually being able to verbalize what that story is and why it matters. Even though you don't understand what this film is saying, the language it speaks is so beautiful and profound that it makes you want to listen anyways. But at the end of the day, as someone who put that time into finding out what those words actually mean, I can't help but feel that they're actually hollow. The way this film is presented is so vague and abstract that it borders on not actually having any substance. I feel as though even if I watched this film 100 times, I wouldn't really gain any significant knowledge in each subsequent rewatch. I'd still just be in awe of the gorgeous animation and the incredible way this film looks. The little bits of story and theme that you ambiently pick up on don't actually fit together without a lot of force. Usually when I analyze a story, it feels good to watch the pieces fall together, because they fit so naturally that it enhances the overall feel of whatever I'm analyzing, to the point that viewing it in retrospect adds to that experience. I can see more of what the author or writer wanted to say, and every choice around that feels related to the core idea of the work of art. But even though I think I've found a satisfying answer as to what the story actually wants to say, it didn't add anything to this short for me. Ultimately, even if the pieces all fit together, they almost seem like they were never meant to. Black feels to me like it was constructed with a clear artistic vision in mind, but I don't think there was ever as clear of a thematic and story vision. And so the end product feels somewhat hollow when viewed in totality. There's a gaping hole in the film where the story and theme are supposed to go that was never really meant to be filled in. And yet the visual style and mastery makes it seem like there is something there, like there will eventually be a satisfying answer. Black has the shell of a short film with profound meaning and thematic depth. But at the end of the day, I don't think the actual content of what it has to say measures up to the expectations the artistry sets. And even if there is a deeper meaning here that I and everyone else online have failed to grasp, I feel as though that message is hidden so well that it ultimately isn't worth it anymore. And so it sits like that, as a short film that's celebrated for daring to say something and be something unique. But at the center of all of that masterful animation, within the layers of abstract images, I don't think Black actually has anything to say. And if it does, I think it didn't properly prioritize that message in the way the film was made. Thank you so much for watching. This was frankly kind of a miserable video to make. I really believe in what I said about the film, but the problem with going into a video about analyzing something that I believe wasn't meant to be analyzed is that it makes the process of writing about it really suck. I basically threw myself off a cliff to prove that there's no message here and that even if there is, it really isn't satisfying to me. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. I would really appreciate it. Thank you again for watching.